Medieval life is often glorified in modern culture. Sure, it had its drawbacks, but it was also an age of knights and castles and kings. Oh, right. Well, actually no. Unless you were one of the very few nobles, medieval life was just brutal. Hi everyone, here's the dark side of medieval life. Welcome to my channel, and today we're exploring the ugly truth about medieval life. From the stench of the cities to the brevity of the peasant's lifespan, let's jump into it. Starting off at number 10, the cities. If you really want to be surrounded by filth, disease, and death, then by all means visit a medieval city. Now, if you were in any other profession, these would have been deal breakers, but apparently not for medieval doctors. That's because medieval cities were basically cesspools of humanity with a lack of sanitation and hygiene. This led to unsanitary conditions and a spread of disease. Plague, typhoid, fever, cholera, leprosy, and smallpox were just some of the diseases that ran rampant through the cities, and they didn't even have antibiotics to treat these afflictions. In fact, during the Black Death outbreak, there weren't enough physicians to go around. But those who did practice medicine employed treatments such as bloodletting and the application of leeches. They believed that illnesses were caused by an imbalance of fluids in the body, and removing some blood would help cure the patient. Unfortunately, this treatment often ended up killing more people than it helped. And the reality was that if you wanted to avoid getting sick, you should probably stay out of the cities. Next, we have marriage. For many of us, the idea of getting married can be pretty intimidating. You have to find someone, pop the question, hope they say yes, then plan a whole wedding. But honestly, considering what marriage was like in the Middle Ages, it might have been better just to remain single. During the Middle Ages, arranged marriages were common, and you had little say in whom you wed. Marriages were usually arranged between families for political or financial gain. And most marriages were between people who had never met before. And this wasn't like going on a blind date. There was no opportunity to get to know your partner beforehand. You simply were told that you were getting married, and that was that. You had no choice in the matter. Children were also married off at a young age. For example, King Henry VIII of England married two of his sisters to a foreign prince when they were only 13 years old. And these unions weren't just between two people. Marriages during the Middle Ages also involved the union of two families, which meant that if you disliked your spouse, you now also had to dislike your spouse's entire family. This could make visiting family gatherings a real treat. Lastly, divorce was nearly impossible to come by. So if you ended up marrying someone who was abusive, you were pretty much stuck with them for life. Number 8, the harvest. The year is 1315. You are a peasant living in Europe. Your lord has just announced that spring has arrived. Finally, after a long winter, you can start planting crops again. As you grab your tools, you think about how the last harvest went. It wasn't great. Hopefully this year will be better. Sadly, this year is worse. A late frost comes and kills most of the crops. Your stomach growls as you realize that you won't have enough food to last the year. Does this sound like a story from the Middle Ages? Well, it could have been. The years between 1315 and 1317 were known as the Great Famine. It began when an unusually cold summer in 1315 resulted in crops failing all over Europe. This led to widespread starvation and death. In some areas, grain prices increased up to 400%. People resorted to eating the bodies of animals that died during the summer. Others turned to cannibalism, selling their own children to wealthy families to be eaten. Even worse, the famine coincided with the outbreak of the Black Death, which only made matters worse. Some historians estimate that between the famine and the plague, a third of Europe's population died. Number 7, work. If you're someone who dislikes your job, consider yourself lucky. At least you don't have to work as hard as medieval peasants did. Peasants worked long hours for little pay. They farmed their lord's land from sunrise to sunset, and still had to pay rent in the form of a portion of their harvest. They also had to complete quotas set by their lords. And if they didn't meet these quotas, they would be heavily fined or even evicted from their homes. On top of farming, peasants also had to do unpaid labor for their lords, such as building a castle or repairing a road. This was called corvée, and it could take peasants away from their farms for weeks at a time. When they returned home, they would fall further behind on their work and would be forced to do even more unpaid labor. It was a never-ending cycle. In addition to all of this, peasants were expected to provide their lord with food from their harvest and give him a portion of whatever money they earned. Peasants rarely had any free time, and if they did, they were too exhausted to do anything. All they could do was sleep and eat before heading back out to the fields. At number 6, justice system. These days, if you commit a crime, you might receive a fine or maybe even spend some time in jail. Thankfully, we've moved away from medieval justice. That's because if you committed a crime during the Middle Ages, your punishment was brutal. In fact, some punishments were reserved for the worst criminals. In some countries, criminals were publicly put to death by hanging, drawing, and quartering. Drawing involved tying the criminal to a horse and dragging him or her around town. Quarter was reserved for particularly heinous criminals and consisted of dismembering the person while they were still alive. The limbs and head would then be cut off and hung from different parts of the city as a warning to others. Other punishments included exile, being sewn up in a sack along with some vermin, or having your hand chopped off if you were caught stealing. Capital punishment was also common. The main forms of capital punishment were burning, crucifixion, and of course, the guillotine. At number 5, medicine. Medieval medicine was brutal, to say the least. Just consider some of the treatments that doctors employed during the time period. Bloodletting was a popular treatment for many ailments, even though it often weakened patients and made their condition worse. Leeches were another popular treatment, even though they could transmit disease. Tremolite was another favorite treatment, which involved a doctor sucking the impurities out of a wound. Yeah, good luck with that. Doctors also had a variety of bizarre instruments they used to treat patients. One instrument, the scarificator, was used to create small cuts on a patient's skin, which would then be treated with a salve. Another instrument, the ruffler, was used to produce a light grating sound, which doctors believed could help reduce inflammation. Lastly, there were female doctors. No, seriously. Female doctors were so rare during the Middle Ages that they were given their own name, barber surgeons. The reason for this was because women weren't allowed to study at universities, so they received their medical knowledge from their fathers or husbands. Most barber surgeons were poor and would travel from village to village treating the sick. In some cases, they were employed by kings or nobles. But no matter who employed them, the reality was that no one took female doctors seriously. Number 4, the food. While we typically think of medieval cuisine as being full of exotic dishes and delicious foods, the reality was quite different for most people. Medieval food was mostly bland and repetitive. The peasant diet consisted of things like root vegetables, cabbage, beans, and peas. They also ate porridge, which was made of boiled grain and water. Occasionally, peasants would enjoy a meat dish, but this was a rare treat. Fish was also a rare delicacy and was usually saved for special occasions. However, sometimes fish could be dangerous. You see, medieval fish were routinely fed plaster and bones, which made them poisonous to eat. Food poisoning was also common since meat was often left out in the open and would attract flies. Flies would then carry disease onto the meat and into the unsuspecting eater. To prevent this, people would cover their food with a cloth or a net to keep the flies out. Lastly, table manners weren't exactly a thing during the Middle Ages. In fact, people commonly shared plates and ate with their hands. They also commonly ate off the floor and didn't bother with utensils. Overall, medieval life was not great, especially when it came to food. At number 3, public transportation. Want to take a trip back in time to experience medieval public transportation? Well, ride-sharing services have you covered? Okay, not really. But you can experience the joys of medieval public transportation by riding the London Underground or taking the New York City subway. That's because medieval public transportation was dirty, uncomfortable, and dangerous. The typical medieval street was filthy and crowded. There were people everywhere, along with horses, carts, and stray animals. It was a nightmare for pedestrians, but it was even worse for those traveling by cart or wagon. Drivers had to contend with pedestrians, animals, and other vehicles. Accidents were common, and fatalities weren't unheard of. On top of all this, most carts and wagons had solid iron wheels, which made for a bumpy ride. And if you were a passenger, you could expect to be jostled around quite a bit. In addition to all of this, medieval bridges were a nightmare to cross. Most bridges were narrow and crowded. They also lacked any sort of safety barriers, so you had to watch your step. One wrong move, and you could fall into the water below. At number 2, servants. If you were a noble during the Middle Ages, you could afford to hire servants to do menial tasks around your house. But that doesn't mean being a servant was a desirable position. That's because servants endured long hours, low pay, and abuse from their employers. In fact, servants were considered property and could be bought, sold, or inherited. They had little rights and were expected to obey their masters without question. It was common for servants to work from before sunrise until well after sunset. They also had to endure verbal and sometimes physical abuse from their masters. Working as a servant was a thankless job, and you had no freedom. In fact, servants weren't even allowed to leave the estate without permission. Masters also spied on their servants to ensure they weren't stealing or misbehaving. Many servants were accused of stealing and were punished severely, sometimes even to the point of death. Also, as if working for no pay and enduring abuse wasn't bad enough, servants also had to deal with creepy landlords. That's because it was common for landlords to require that female servants share a room together, which meant that they had little privacy and could be forced to sleep in the same bed. At number 1, life expectancy. With rampant disease, war, and famine plaguing medieval Europe, it's no surprise that the average life expectancy during the Middle Ages was only 30 years. This means that most people didn't live long enough to reach adulthood, and those who did reach adulthood rarely lived past the age of 50. Most people simply died of some sort of disease, or were killed in a battle or during a violent uprising. Even if you managed to avoid all of these, life was still dangerous. Medieval buildings were poorly constructed, and fires were common. Streets were poorly lit, so nighttime was dangerous to travel. And as we mentioned earlier, public transportation was a nightmare. Thanks for watching. What was the most surprising part of medieval life? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button.